So the last session before that break time is understanding the Paris alignment performance dynamics of countries in the search for impact. And this is from DPAM. And we've got Aidan Gell, who is a doctoral researcher from the University of Liège. And we also have Florent Griffon, who is responsible investment specialist from DPAM. So please welcome them both to the stage. I didn't see what was happening behind me, so I'm assuming they went on stage behind me. Oh, I think they're here now. I think they were continuing to work outside. Well, welcome to the stage. Thank you. They were being very conscientious. Thank you.
So 20 minutes, right? Okay. All right. So first of all, thank you very much for having us today. So it's a pleasure being here. Basically, we are. Sorry, where's the whatever to switch? Oh, perfect. I am gonna need this one. So thank you. So I'm here today with my colleague Florent Griffon. So myself, I'm from the University of Liège, and I will be presenting mostly a project we did in common with the Degroof Petercam Asset Management. And then my colleague will speak more on impact investment. So to begin with, the Paris Performance Ranking. So this is a joint initiative we started together with DPAM and the University of Liège. And the idea was mainly to develop a methodology to assess countries' performances regarding the Paris Agreement, but as we call it, going beyond mitigation. So as you will see, the idea was really to not only focus on national emissions, as it's usually the case, but trying to embrace the entire contribution of a country when it also comes to the common international effort. So there we are. So I think we all know, and I think all of you do, that right now we are not exactly on track of meeting the goals we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement. So that famous goal of being below 2° global warming by the end of the century, and ideally below 1.5. Well, right now we're more at 3.2. So there's a lot of work left. And the question was, well, all those assessments we see, by the IPCC, by the UNEP, well, they're usually on a global level, and even the global stocktake at the last COP was on a global collective level. So the question was, what is each country individually doing, and how do they contribute to us actually filling up that gap and reaching that 1.5°? And so there are a lot of methodologies out there. I think some of you might know, like Climate Change Performance Index or Environmental Performance Index from Yale. But they all have one thing in common, that they only focus on mitigation. What does a country do with its national level emissions? And so this can be greenhouse gas emissions reductions or compared to certain benchmarks. Sometimes it's about energy usage or greenhouse gas intensity per GDP. Sometimes it's about renewable energies. What's the energy mix of that country? But it's always about how do they reduce their own emissions. And even if that's a big part, actually, well, it's definitely not all of it. And so our question was, how do we come up with a ranking, a methodology that goes beyond that? So how do we actually cover the rest of a country's actions? And so we started, well, of course, with something quite evident, the Paris Agreement. This was our starting point. And we thought, well, that agreement is quite complex, and we all know about the 1.5° and the 2°, but there is so much more to it. And so that little illustration just gives you a taste of that. So of course there is mitigation, then there's adaptation, and then there's the well-known finance part, right? We're all concerned about this one, where on one side it's about aligning financial flows with reaching 1.5° and increasing resilience to climate change. And then there is the responsibility of developed countries to provide developing countries with international climate finance. But then there is all the rest. So you see here there is something about technology transfer. There is about capacity building. There is the question of loss and damage. There is the question of preserving carbon sinks. There is even something about education. And there is a lot about transparency, and how do countries communicate about their efforts. And so we wanted to embrace as much as possible of all those different categories in our methodology. So we started off with, well, the list you just saw, and then started sort of an iterative process. On one hand, we had our theoretical framework, and then we had, well, the data availability, because actually there's a lot of issues with the available data. And so we tried to figure out which were the most essential categories to assess, and which one were also the ones we could actually assess. And so at the end of that process, we ended up with 6 categories that we wanted for sure to have reflected in the model on one way or the other. So might be a dimension on its own, or at least one indicator. So we had climate change mitigation, of course, it's the Paris Agreement, climate change adaptation, finance, technology transfer and capacity building, and multilateral transparency. So this is our starting point. Now, before we dig into the model and I show you the results, there's something really important about the Paris Agreement that we wanted to include in our model, which is the question of fairness. What is fair? What should every country actually do in terms of responsibilities and capabilities? So that's in the Paris Agreement, it's called the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities Principles. Because indeed, it's a common issue we have, but not everyone has contributed to it on the same level. And so we base ourselves on, let's say, a very basic formula that kind of reaches some sort of consensus, but equity and fairness remains a very political question. So of course, depending on where you go in the world, people will not agree with that formula. But so basically, the idea is to stay as close as possible to the text itself and say, okay, it's a common issue, but it differs based on your historical responsibilities, how much you have emitted in the past. It depends on your capability, so the more you can actually act on reducing emissions, the more you actually should. And your percentage of the global world population, because, well, that's the equality factor, which is also an important one. We should actually all contribute commonly to solve that issue. So that's basically how we calculate fairness, and whenever possible, might this be emissions, might this be your contributions to international climate finance, this is what we try to achieve. We try to calculate the country's fair share and then compare it to what it's actually doing. So for you as a little example, and also to kind of better understand almost a third of the indicators, pathway analysis. So whenever you try to assess a country's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, well, you can have a look at intensity or you can have a look at absolute values, but it doesn't tell you much. So the best thing to do is to compare it to different benchmarks. And in our case, we had 3 different benchmarks. So on the very top, you say current policy. So this is the trajectory on which a country currently is with the policies in place. By 2030, it will emit X amount of CO2 emissions. Then you have the NDC pathway. So this is the one that would be actually compatible with the target it set itself, its nationally determined contribution, which it declared to all other parties. Then you have the 1.5 degree pathway. So here you take a global 1.5 degree scenario where we actually meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, and you split it up among countries. And here you compare, okay, well, France, for example, should just emit X amount, but currently it is emitting way more. So this is what we call then our 1.5 degree gap. It's the difference between the two. And then you have the fair 1.5 degree gap, where here comes into place the equity considerations we talked about before, where you actually try to evaluate, okay, we have a common carbon budget that would actually allow us to meet 1.5 degree global warming, and then we try to split it up based on your historical emissions, your capability to act. And then this results in some amount of CO2 emissions that would actually be fair for your specific country. So these are the benchmarks we use. We use this for current emissions and projected emissions, so that's something good to keep in mind. And there were some other, I would say, rules we try to stick to. So first of all, when it comes to composite indicators, because that's actually what it is, it's always quite clear that your theoretical framework is the most important part. So we really try to stick as close as possible to the Paris Agreement itself. And so there are a lot of other things one could assess, financial policies or the credibility of a country's commitments, but we really try to stick to the Paris Agreement and the text itself. Then indicators, they must be comparable among countries. So especially for adaptation, you will always see there's a lot of debate about how do you measure a country's vulnerability to climate change? How do you measure its adaptation efforts? Because actually these things are very much dependent on the economic development of that said country. And so in our case, we opted for process-based factors, like does it have a national adaptation plan in place? Did it do a climate risk analysis? Has it a monitoring and reporting system in place, which are usually less dependent of the economic development, because these are really just the fundamentals we expect from a government to then kind of push that adaptation effort. And then regarding data availability, as I said, it's pretty scarce, so that's an issue. So we set for something that must at least be updated biannually, fitting, therefore, the reporting cycle of the Paris Agreement itself. And it must cover all the countries in our current scope, because we do want to avoid data imputation at all cost, because once you start engaging with sovereigns about their position in the ranking, it's quite tricky if you have basically statistically made up some of the data. And then regarding the rest, weighting and aggregation, so this is an important one. We opted for a geometric aggregation. So for those who don't like formulas and math, basically just linear aggregation is just a weighted average, right, of your indicators. And in our case, we multiply the scores of the different indicators among each other. And the reason for this is that if you multiply them, well, one bad performance really drags you down. And the advantage of this is that it better reflects what we must do in the situation of the Paris Agreement, because we can't just be good on one indicator. We can't just all be very good in adapting, because we also have to do the mitigation part. But we can't also just mitigate, because we will have to adapt. And developed countries, they can't just mitigate their own emissions. They have to support the developing ones. So you really have to be good on all indicators and not just on a few, and then compensate basically bad performances with a good one. So this is a very important part. Weighting was done with, of course, a group of experts. So we gathered international experts in climate change governance to help us set up the weights. And we didn't want to go for the classical equal weighting or what you have, because it's just simpler and sometimes maybe easier to communicate. So you will see there are a few with 12.2, 7.6, but that was the choice we made. And finally, sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. So of course, every time you see a ranking, might this be companies, ESG scores, countries, universities, whatever, always keep in mind there are a lot of methodological choices, assumptions that are made, and they do impact the final ranking. So of course, it's always important to kind of quantify this and understand, well, maybe that country in my final version is ranked 13th, but if I had chosen a linear aggregation, it would be 12th or 9th or 8th. So that's something to keep in mind, also always keeping a critical perspective on these kind of rankings, but it's an exercise still worth doing. So here is our theoretical framework completed. So what we have is our 6 categories. So you have current emissions, you have adaptation, you have projected emissions, the country's net zero target, you have multilateral transparency, and you have means of implementation. So in our case, you see current emissions and projected emissions are evaluated against the benchmarks we saw before through pathway analysis. Adaptation, exclusively process-based indicators. Then you have net zero target, where we evaluate the stringency of a country's net zero target by the target year, the gas coverage, and the legal status of it, which our experts believe is one of the most important factors, actually. And means of implementation, which covers climate finance, capacity building, and technology transfer, trying to assess to what extent the country is actually supporting developing countries in meeting their own targets. And the last one, multilateral transparency, where we look at the timeliness, the completeness, and the transparency of the country's biennial reports, the UNFCCC, based on expert evaluation. So based on these indicators, our countries, you have to know that the Paris Agreement itself has a weird structure. So basically, it functions based on lists. You have 3 lists. You have the Annex 1 countries, which are considered to be the developed ones. You have then an Annex 2, which is part of those countries, but not all of them. So basically, Annex 1 is all the developed countries, OECD from 1991 plus former Soviet Union, Annex 2 just OECD from 1991, and then you have the non-Annex 1, which is basically all the rest of the world. And so we decided to follow these structures. Why? Because, well, your promises and your obligations vary depending on which list you are. So Annex 2 countries, they committed to supporting developing countries. With climate finance, technology transfer, what you have, while former Soviet Union states, they didn't promise anything. So we do not evaluate them based on these factors. So for now, we cover Annex 2, so former OECD from 1991, 23 countries. But the goal, of course, is to extend the scope over time. And so when we have a look at our, let's say, preliminary results, so the first edition, we hope, of course, to kind of have discussions, to get challenged, to improve that methodology over time. So for now on, this is what came up. So you had, purely coincidental, I have to say, German-speaking states that came at the very top. So Austria, top spot, Germany, Switzerland, and of course, the United States, without much of a surprise, who's closing the ranking with a pretty low score. There are a few surprises, I think, for each and every one. Sometimes it's influenced by the geometric aggregation. So first of all, geometric aggregation tends to create a lot of disparity between scores. So you see, in our case, Austria has almost 5 times more points than US. Does it mean that they do 5 times more? I don't think you could formulate it that way, but at least they have 5 times a higher score. I think a good example here, since we are in that wonderful country of Luxembourg, Luxembourg 13th. And interestingly here is that it's a country that actually does extremely well in terms of emissions. So based on our different benchmarks, it was ranked 2nd in terms of emissions. But it is by far not meeting its fair share in supporting developing countries. So for an example, countries pledge to provide 100 billion a year to developing countries for climate finance. Based on the fair share calculations, Luxembourg would have to disburse almost 5 billion a year. Right now, they are at 17 million. So you see, this alone kind of drags it down way lower than its initial 2% if we just had focus on mitigation. And so I think that's a very good example, actually, from why we wanted to go beyond mitigation. Because that's the thing. If you just look at mitigation, you believe, oh, that's perfect, nothing to change, we're on track. But then you realize that there is so much more to it, and the support of developing countries actually matters way more in reaching the global goal of 1.5 degree than just reducing the emissions of Luxembourg. Similar example would be Iceland, so very similar situation there. Excellent score in terms of emissions, but unfortunately losing a lot of points due to support of developing countries. And surprisingly, in New Zealand, exactly the opposite. So New Zealand doing quite badly in terms of emissions, but actually, probably because of its geographical location and a lot of exchanges they have with small island states, well, actually, they do quite well, and they do support them a lot with adaptation initiatives, technology transfer, capacity building, which then allows the country to kind of step up and basically meet Luxembourg somewhere in the middle of the ranking. So for us, I think really the key message would be that whenever you think about a country's performance, about climate change, meeting a 1.5 degree target, kind of try to widen the scope and not only look at, okay, how are we doing in terms of emission on our territory, but what do we do to reach that common and global effort? Because it's something that we will either manage or fail collectively, and there is no individual performance that actually really matters. What counts is that we contribute as much as we can to that global effort. And so that's really something to keep in mind. That being said, I will leave the floor to my colleague.
Thank you, Aidan. So we could see that we obviously need solutions for climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and beyond. We've been talking about contribution, and that's, I would say, a bit of a common point and a natural transition towards the second topic, which is about impact investing. So impact investing in the listed sphere not talking about private equity or private debt here, but impact invested, really investing in listed equity and in corporate debt. So it's a bit of a, I would not say a strange animal, but it's slightly different from what impact investing used to be. But it's nevertheless, I would argue, a very useful complement to sustainable finance in general. So let's look at how impact investing is meant to bring solutions to different environmental and social issues. Well, first of all, what is impact investing? We like to use the definition from the Global Impact Investing Network. I'm not going to read it here, but it basically put on the same level the fact of bringing solution to environmental and social issues, and at the same time looking for, obviously, a financial return, which means it's slightly different from, let's say, conventional sustainable finance, which may still be a little bit putting financial return at first and trying to achieve it while mitigating ESG risks as well as possible. Here, we are really into investing in solutions. That means we are looking for opportunities that are both, once again, environmental and social solutions, and at the same time, interesting investment opportunities. And we very much believe it's possible to combine both through a smart selection. And how do we do that? Notably, we try to rely on external ESG experts, internal ESG experts, leverage resources internally and externally as much as possible. And I'm going to go back on that later, but looking at both quantitative metrics and also qualitative assessment. So how do we come up with our investment ideas? Well, the starting point is first to also define what is impact, what is not. How do we do that? We don't come up with our own definition, because everyone can do that, and then it's become very difficult for the client to understand and external stakeholder. We start with a taxonomy that was issued by the GIN called the IRIS Plus thematic taxonomy, impact thematic taxonomy. You have 9 themes and 53 sub-themes. I'm not going to cover them all, it would be way too long, but you can see already it's about nutrition, it's about sustainable agriculture, about transportation, infrastructure, of course about energy, renewables, smart grids, etc. It's also about healthcare, access to medicine, access to healthcare services in general, about clean manufacturing, making the cities more livable, more sustainable. So both, also education, training, so both on the social side and environmental side, also, for instance, providing affordable quality accommodation to as many people as possible. And so for each of these themes, we are going to review the companies we are considering for investments. We are going to check, to make it short, 2 things. First, to what extent the activity of the company is aligned with these impact themes. Alignment defined based only on the products and services sold. That's an important distinction. And that's a big difference with, let's say, sustainable investing the conventional way. We are not looking at, we are not validating a company as an impact company just because it says it's providing 25 hours of training a year to its employees, or because it created X amount of jobs. We believe that this could be acceptable for sustainable fund. For an impact fund, we really look at the product and services sold and to what extent those are solutions to the environmental and social problems that we're all facing globally. So it can be based on the alignment in terms of revenue, it can be based on the CapEx when we don't have revenue figures that are reliable enough, or it can be based, this alignment analysis on, let's say, more sector-specific metrics. For instance, if you look at a company managing real estate assets, you will have data in terms of either the number of assets or the surface of the all assets that the company is managing. So then you're going to use these alternative metrics. Also for utilities, it's better to look at the power generation capacity installed rather than just the revenues, for instance, which is much more variable. Next to this analysis of the alignment, we'll also, well, these are actually examples, but just to say, we'll also look at the way the company is managed to ensure that we have no problem with the do no significant harm principle. So to make sure that we don't have too many ESG controversies and that the company, the way it is managed, basically doesn't go against the interests of its stakeholders and that it is managed in a harmonious manner. So you always have the 2 pillars. You have a few examples here, just to give a bit of color. You can see typically on education and employment, we are also looking at education and training applications, for instance. Also some names in the healthcare and access to medicine theme. about infrastructure, transportation, well, soft mobility, clean mobility, and so on. A name in forestry management called Weyerhaeuser, so managing very large areas of forest in a sustainable manner in Northern America, and promoting the use of wood as a green construction material. Some names in the recycling sphere as well, and of course some renewables. So these are just a few examples among others. And as I said, in DPAM's view, because we are invested here on listed impact, it's important that we differentiate also that kind of investment from, let's say, conventional sustainable fund. That means that we'll also have a higher level of expectation in terms of the way the company is managed. We'll have a much lower tolerance for ESG controversies or problems with stakeholders, may it be on the environmental side or social side. So you can see on the very right side, we're talking about SFDR Article 9 products. That means that, as we always say with our colleagues, if you start to have discussions around the name, about its impact narrative, why is it impact, and about the way it's managed, probably you should not be invested. That's how you make a difference between what is a conventional sustainable fund and what is really an impact fund on the listed side, which has to be, let's say, very clean and very strict in terms of the management of ESG risks. And just a few takeaways to remember. So we are talking about really financing solutions once again. So we have much less subjectivity compared to sustainable funds because we look at products and services, to what extent you have a significant level of net positive alignment. So that means that you will deduct from the positive side of the impact story, the negative side. What you want is a company which is significantly positively exposed to these impact themes altogether. That means it's also more objective because you're not just going to accept and take for granted, let's say, the objectives that the company is setting itself. You really look at the actual profile of the company at the moment. We are using a well-defined governance, so we are referring to the IRIS Plus thematic taxonomy from the GIN to make sure that we don't come up with our own list of impact themes. We use widely recognized industry standard there. We have set up internal committees to validate every single name to make sure it's once again net positive aligned with these different impact themes and that you don't have any problem with the do no significant harm principle. Yeah, as I said as well, we are much more strict, both in terms of quantitative indicators, impact indicators that have to be achieved, and also overall, the impact narrative must make sense. Once again, if you start challenging a name, that means you should not be invested. An important part as well of impact investing in the listed sphere, also to talk about the principle of additionality, if some of you are familiar with it. How do you also show that in the listed sphere you have additionality? Additionality is to prove that the fact that you make this investment is actually bringing a positive value that would not have happened if you hadn't made the investment. This is more obvious on the private debt side or private equity side, but in listed equity, for instance, you could say, yeah, if I don't invest, maybe the company will still be there and will still be developing these products. That's why it's important to do active ownership. So to engage a lot with the companies and also to align the voting practices in general assemblies with these impact stories. So to push the company to go in the direction of developing more, let's say, impact products in its line, in its range of products, in its activity altogether. Also to support the company in its effort to adopt best practices from an ESG point of view. So by doing that, you also contribute to achieving additionality. And it's also very important to report both quarterly and annually on the actual progress of the portfolio of different companies from an impact point of view. So using aggregated figure at portfolio level, of course, climate aspects, carbon footprint, carbon intensity, biodiversity footprint, water, etc., resource use, also on the social side. And also on a line-by-line basis as well, using as much as possible the impact metrics provided by the companies. So transparency is very important as well, because measurability of the impact is one of the key elements of impact investing, and therefore one of the key points here. Voilà. If you have questions, I'm very happy to answer them. It can also be on Aidan's presentation.
We have a question right at the back, so I'll get the microphone to you as quickly as I can.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really good. In terms of investor engagement, how have you seen trends around the interest of investors in impact investing? And what kind of dialogue do you have with them to encourage, if you do, interest in impact investing products?
So I think there is definitely an emerging interest in also listed impact products, also because it's a more pure product versus all sorts of sustainable fund and ESG fund that you can find on the market. So it brings more clarity because once again, there is more objectivity to it. It's not about arguing that the CEO set itself some objective in 3, 5, 10 years that maybe it's not going to match. Here, you really see what the situation of the company, to what extent is it aligned, positively aligned, and so it's also, you can have more clear metrics. So I would say it's more tangible and more objective. You also have the traditional, let's say, impact investor on the private side, which is, it has a common DNA, but in terms of process, it cannot be exactly the same. So I think that kind of product is very much positioned in between the existing sustainable product offering and then the more, let's say, how to say, the smaller market, the smaller segment, the more niche segments of the private impact funds. So it's an emerging segment, but I think it's definitely bringing an added value compared to existing offering. Yeah.
Question just here.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, my question is a little bit more on the operational side. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a lot about screening and looking at different KPIs mm-hmm. and the impact. But going a little bit more in the traditional finance approach, is this something that you apply in terms of discount rates or some type of metric that ends up having a different valuation compared to a traditional asset? And if that's the case, if it's having an effect in terms of pricing of the instruments? No, it's not. We don't. No, the answer to the question is no. The approach from a financial point of view is not fundamentally different. It's more really on the ESG side that we approach the whole product differently with the process I've been discussing now. So I think opposing always, let's say, the ENS aspect with the financial aspect may be less true actually with that kind of product, because it's a lot about the selection, it's a lot about the stock picking, it's a lot about finding the smart investment ideas quite early on. So just to find the sweet spot when the companies are already growing, we bring scalability as well because we invest early. Voilà, but yeah, the answer to your question initially is no. Yeah.
Another question here. They're all on this side. Ah, good.
Yes, very good presentation. I'm wondering, how do you distinguish thematic approaches in comparison to the impact here? Because we saw very specific sectors like agriculture. And then the second question is to research a PhD about SFDR and Paris alignment. Now you have extended the scope. How are you viewing Article 9 alignment? Because it has a specific criteria related to Paris Agreement. So these are my two questions. Thank you.
It is very similar to a thematic fund. It's a multi-thematic fund in that case. So indeed, yes, it's in the understanding, it's something in between an Article 8+, as we would say, and I would say, yeah, indeed, it's something quite similar. You had a question on the Article 9 funds. I'm not sure I got the second question, to be honest.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm wondering, since you are looking into Paris Agreement, and it's one of the criteria for being Article 9, according to SFDR. So I'm wondering, since you extended the scope from carbon reductions to other areas in this right, I'm wondering if you're viewing that your funds can have a Article 9 classification broader than just carbon reduction. Thank you.
I'm not totally sure how to answer that one, but Article 9 product invested in sovereign debt very often will be in green bond or that kind of product. Here we're talking about an index, so we're not talking about a product in itself. It's really about ranking countries and do that slightly differently from what is actually available already. So Aidan was not presenting a product. If you insist, we can maybe develop something further. Yeah, but
And you had a question for the researcher as well, didn't you? Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting as well. My question is really on the engagement. So how do you describe the engagement that you are able to achieve given the asset class that you target?
Mm-hmm. engagement, I mean, usually goes both through collaborative initiative when they're available, but also direct engagement as much as possible. The difference will be that the engagement here will push a little bit more on the impact side, so both in terms of adopting quantitative objectives, preferably on a fairly short time horizon, and monitoring year after year how the company is doing there and whether it's on the right pathway or not. Also, of course, sending a signal to the companies in terms of, let's say, the lines of products and services we consider to be positive impact ones, the ones that we would see negatively. Voilà. What's interesting as well is that because we're also invested, let's say, quite a lot in small and mid caps, mechanically, you also have a bit more weight as well there. If you would be invested in blue chips, yeah, you're diluted in the mass, so they still answer, but you, of course, have less weight unless you go through a collaborative initiative. And we, as I said as well, we really link as much as possible the voting practices, so we can adapt the way we vote on board members, on remuneration packages, or of course also support the resolutions in terms of more reporting with these companies. But it's also about pushing for more reporting on impact metrics from companies, obviously, because even though they make progress, there's still a room for improvement with most of them. So yeah. But the engagement is even more systematic compared to a normal sustainable fund. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah, hello, my name is Marian Unterstell. Many thanks for the great presentation. I'm a doctoral researcher in law at the University of Luxembourg, and I was wondering if you could give me more insights on your thoughts on the legal framework, because you spoke a little bit about Article 8 and 9, but as far as I know, impact investing is not directly known under these legal frameworks. The only thing we have now is ESMA brought out guidelines for the investment fund names. We have impact funds now under, but there is no direct label or something like that for impact investment funds. If you could,
You can find on the market some impact funds Article 8. Clearly, there are several. Some of them actually like to do that because then they can be a bit, let's say, weaker on other parts of the investment process. What I've been presenting now are Article 9 products. So you could actually see it as, at the same time, one Article 9 and an impact product. It combines both in the process. That's also why I said that on the do no significant harm, we are much more strict already. I mean, we're already strict with Article 8 product, but on this one, we don't really want to have any discussion. So yeah, you don't really, as you just said, have a clear link between the fact that you are impact or not. You also need to understand that impact investing can be very different depending on the asset class and also from one manager to another. Some will just tell you that if you just have a few quantitative objective sets on a monothematic strategy, for instance, and if the companies in portfolio achieve that, then it will be impact. This is more, let's say, the old school, let's say, private side understanding of impact, which is fine, but it's something a bit different. Here, being in a listed sphere, if you come up with an impact fund, in our view at DPAM, it has to be Article 9. And the added value is there as well, to go a bit away from these discussions, whether this name and so on can be in portfolio or not to hide behind an investment process as well. I think we need more objectivity in general, and that's what the product is designed to bring.
Do you think a change of the...
I'm just going to give you the mic because it's being recorded.
Sorry for taking so much time, but I was wondering if a revision of the framework with the SFDR 2 maybe coming out in the next years, if it could be helpful or beneficial to introduce new requirements on impact that we could create more comparability, or do you think in the market that's just not possible because it's so different what impact might be? And that it makes no sense trying to regulate it?
I don't have the answer. Otherwise, there would be a clear answer. I think we would already have such smart regulation. But it's impact, as I just said, is very diverse. And that's also what we don't like too much, to have something too diverse, because then people find it difficult to see through it. And then it's difficult to choose which investment strategy you want to invest in or not. So this is what we're trying to bring here, obviously, to bring something which is less subjective, clearly. So, but I respect the way other people may be doing impact. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you.
A final question here, and you can answer too.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. And that's actually a question for Aiden. Leila Kamara, I'm doctor in sustainable investment, and I was very interested in listening to your research results, and was wondering whether this ranking would be addressed to nationals, or to whom exactly are you proposing this solution? And also interested in knowing what type of experts you were working during this research analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so first, the ranking itself, it was really developed as a request from DPAM. So I think now mostly used as an engagement tool, but it's available online. So there is now a website that was developed, so you can find it with all the results. On our side, we are working on the scientific article, of course, so then it will also be available to the community itself. The idea is really to push for widening the scope, because now even in the IPCC report, in the last one, they talk about these kind of rankings, like the Climate Change Performance Index is mentioned in the latest IPCC report. And there has been some research on the political impact of these metrics. And so that's something that we now want to push more. Like, we want to try to evaluate the political impact of these kind of rankings, because there is a lot of theory out there that actually through engagement, financial actors actually can push for policy change. And this kind of peer-to-peer comparison really has a role in that. So this was kind of the starting point for us to now really dig into these topics more. But so the ranking itself, it's available online, and the methodology itself will be discussed in more length in the article that hopefully will follow soon. You know the struggle. And then remind me, please, your second question.
Just to know which kind of experts you were collaborating with.
Yeah, so the idea, we did what we call an analytical hierarchy process survey. So it's a methodology that usually requires a small group of experts that dedicate but more time. So we had 6 experts that were a mix from UNFCCC negotiators, NGOs, climate finance practitioners, and academics. So the idea was to have an international panel, of course, to avoid like country biases. And then having them share basically their very different sometimes point of views to come to an agreement. So now our objective is to, from let's say edition to edition, we would like to widen a little bit the scope of experts. And something that we really would try to include are more perspectives from Global South, because for now that's something that is still missing, because we had people that were originally from Global South, but that are working in institutions here in Luxembourg, for example. So already not like, maybe not exactly the point of view that you would get from someone from the Global South. So hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So much. Thank you to both of you. It's a wonderful talk and presentation. Thank you.
Merci.